papers. The way we're going to go through this is that we're going to have each of the panelists, the third speakers along the way, each panelist will give a 10-minute address talking about some areas, and I'll elaborate on the areas. And then we'll open it up for discussion in that hour. So I'm going to begin first with Dr. or Professor Anupam Chander. Learned that he's from Punjab, kind of close to where I spent a year in India on my sabbatical. Punjab is where we got the pajamas. Okay. Kind of trivia, I know, like trivial person, I win all the time, but what's the use,
pajamas,
right?
Pajamas is actually Hindi word, of all things.
Right. Okay. Interesting thing is that he's got a book coming out called The Electronic Silk Road. The book we gather is actually out in the warehouse, not here. And he's talking about law and policy, and he's done quite a bit of work in that area. He's from UC Davis, director of the California International Law Center, does quite a bit of work on law and policy in Silicon Valley. So he's going to talk about 10 minutes on general area of internet law and policy. China has a big part to play in this because of China's e-commerce and how it's growing big, as you would know. Then we'll have Peter talking about IP. Peter, as you know, needs no introduction. The big thing that you may not know is that he doesn't actually sleep. I mean, the guy works all the time. It's amazing. Yeah, very productive. His work is in IP area, intellectual property, and help put Michigan State Law School on IP map, and I know. And then it's now with Drake, again doing the IP law. And our third panelist is Guobin Yang. Done quite a bit of work in the area of social movement, social activism. Learned that he's got 2 PhDs, so Dr. Yang. And he's been with the Cirque as well. I think the first time I met him was in Beijing. So we'll talk 10 minutes again on the area. So we're going to cover a breadth of issues on internet law and policy, beginning with Anupam.
Great. Hi, goodness. So let me also commend Dr. Guobin Yang's book, The Power of the Internet in China, if you haven't read it. It's a must-read, obviously, for those in the area. Okay, so let me begin. I want to talk a little bit about the internet in China, but I'm going to come at it obliquely from the perspective of American companies largely. And so I want to begin with a quote from this last week. President Obama says, nobody is listening to your phone calls. And his audience there is Americans. He's telling Americans, don't worry, we're not listening to your phone calls, right? But what of the phone calls of foreigners? This, of course, leaves a big hole in his statement. The words that he offered were hardly comforting for those outside the United States. And so in my opening remarks, I'll focus on the obligations then of American corporations, the kind of lacuna that's created in American law, in particular to those in non-democratic states. So I'm going to focus my remarks in particular on obligations of kind of new media enterprises from the United States operating in non-democratic states. And while many have denounced Google, Microsoft, Yahoo for betraying their obligations to the people of China often and other repressive regimes through complicity with state repression, few have sought to explain why these companies might owe obligations to distant peoples. This is a lacuna not just in legal scholarship, but also in the existing codes of corporate responsibility. And so my goal here in this short introduction is to try to focus on these kind of corporate responsibility aspect. Corporate responsibility codes such as the United States Global Compact and the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises rarely mention free speech outside a general call, a kind of implicit call for corporations to respect human rights. So that's as close as they get to free speech concerns. Now, this gap, I think, is understandable to a large extent, given the history. The corporate social responsibility movement developed in response to the rise of the global supply chain of modern manufacture. Corporate social responsibility audits are accordingly written for this paradigm, reviewing child and forced labor, put this water cup down, but there's computers everywhere here. And so, and having spilled once a tiny drop of coffee when I set my coffee cup down at a coffee shop, and having it land on my laptop keyboard and on my MacBook keyboard, and having the keyboard cease to function and the computer becoming useless immediately thereafter. I'm very cautious about such things. So these audits, of course, are written for reviewing child and forced labor, wages, worker safety, freedom to organize, discrimination, environmental and community impact, not corporate complicity in suppressing dissent. But given Silicon Valley's role in the world, it's essential that corporate social responsibility turn its attention to such enterprises as well. And so what obligations do Google, Yahoo, and Facebook have to the people of these states abroad? I consider this question through the lens of theories of social responsibility of corporations. And I want to identify three main theories. Before I do that, I'll put a plug in for the book. Again, I know it's been mentioned already, but the book has a chapter on China. The last chapter, of course, in a book on the Silk Road, you have to talk about China, and I do end with a discussion of China. The book is an attempt by me to understand the regulation of cyberspace as a kind of commercial space across the world. So you can see that it resounds with my remarks this afternoon, I should say. Or the middle of the night, I should say, California time, which is where my body is still functioning. Okay. So let me talk about theories of corporate transnational social responsibility. I want to identify three. I might also mention that the core of this is based on paper, and you can read a much lengthier version of my remarks via the web. It's a paper called "Googling Freedom" from the California Law Review, just a short while ago. So let me identify three theories of transnational corporate social responsibility. The shareholder wealth maximization norm, whose patron saint is, of course, Milton Friedman. That theory is generally translated into the international arena without modification if the responsibility of a corporation is to maximize shareholder wealth within the bounds of the law. That limitation on management must extend to its operations abroad. After all, how can we justify greater social obligations to foreigners than to one's compatriots, right? If you have such limited obligations at home, why might you have greater obligations abroad? An alternative view sees a corporation as a global citizen. This view sees the multinational corporations as having obligations that extend to all the communities in which its employees and consumers live. It's a view that resides in the dignity of all human beings. A third view seeks the best of both worlds. Call it the global citizenship as global shareholder wealth maximization. This view sees human rights and good citizenship as instrumental to achieving long-term business success. Local disorder might itself harm future business prospects. More importantly, consumers might boycott businesses they find distasteful. This view suggests a kind of happy coincidence between the first two views. Now, the second and third views seem ready-made to insist on the responsibilities of Google and its peers in repressive states. It's the first view, and I don't have to kind of elaborate on that. I think that's pretty self-evident. It's the first view, however, that I want to explore. It's the one that you would imagine would be the most tricky for the effort to impose corporate social responsibility on these corporations as they venture abroad. Now, in 2005, in 2005, Richard Posner, of course, embraced the view that he on his blog, of course, that he shared with Gary Becker, a Nobel laureate, that corporations had no social responsibility beyond maximizing shareholder value, adhering to contracts, and obeying the law, right? But a year later, however, speaking of American internet companies operating in China, specifically, he wrote, for our companies actively to assist a foreign repressive regime to persecute its political and religious dissidents is a step beyond. So there's a kind of seeming incoherence between the first two, between these two statements. You know, the idea that they have no social responsibility beyond obeying the law and maximizing shareholder value, and then to say that to assist a repressive regime is a step beyond, is not permissible in some way. So what explains this? So how can we possibly kind of reconcile these two statements? Now, when Milton Friedman described what he called business in a free society, which was where he kind of initially located this shareholder wealth maximization norm, he kind of essentially begged the question, what is the responsibility of business in an unfree society? Okay. And so the argument that I want to offer is as follows. The assumption here is that individuals enter into voluntary relationships with the corporation and thus must do so in a mutually beneficial manner. Okay. But what if the corporation is the secret spy of the secret police in an autocratic society? Then entering into a voluntary relationship with the corporation might actually reduce one's utility if the secret police take a special interest in that person. The individual then might rather stand as the unwilling victim of tort, as we describe it in the law, rather than a beneficiary of a freely made contract. And in this sense, then, this general assumption of shareholder wealth maximization also being consonant with individual utility maximization, okay, the assumption behind Friedman's and Becker and Posner's view wouldn't hold, right? So contrast the United States, so step back into the free society that we have in the United States, at least to a great extent. In the United States, the people have the ability, should they choose, to compel corporations to disclose what they are doing on behalf of the state. The law, of course, currently permits secrecy in this regard. So I'm not saying that's what the law is. At least there's a controversy about what the law is, I should say. So I'm not making a claim as to what the law is, what FISA, what the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act currently requires. But it certainly could require, through the political process, this kind of disclosure. Now, I'm not suggesting that corporations in the United States don't bear social responsibilities to American citizens. What I am suggesting simply is that one reason to insist on responsibilities by corporations operating in unfree societies is because the local law cannot be expected to provide those same kinds of constraints. Okay, constraints that would be, from the Becker, Posner, Friedman perspective, utility maximizing. And so that's the gist of the argument of the paper. Now, for the last few years, I should go back to the current lawmaking here. Congress has considered a Global Online Freedom Act that would bar American corporations from disclosing information in unfree states. Okay, it would tell Google, you can't turn over information to the Chinese authorities. Now, under the heading of transparency, it has a very odd kind of provision. The act would require search engines and content hosting companies to report what is being censored to the US government, okay, to the US State Department in particular. Now, by directing the reporting obligations to the US government rather than to the people of the repressive state, the act effectively would turn new media companies from spies for China to spies for the United States, right? And this is, of course, echoed, you find an echo of this in President Obama's statement from last week, this notion that don't worry, we aren't listening to you. And so these companies are not assisting us in surveilling American people. Now, so to conclude here, just to tie the knot, the ultimate result of last week's disclosures may be that Western corporations embrace corporate social responsibility. This is the optimistic view, certainly, okay? Not only for its own sake, but as a means to maximize shareholder wealth. They recognize that being cast as spies for the US will undermine their ability to attract consumers outside the United States. Companies like Twitter have been recognized already for resisting US surveillance efforts. Ultimately, then, we'll need a system that ensures due process not just for Americans, but for foreigners whose information comes into American hands. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next with Peter talking about IP. I've asked him to give some background before talking about intermediary liability. It's the issue of the ISPs being held liable for acts of copyright violation. And it's a big issue in this area. Yeah.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is to use my opening remarks to provide linkage between some of the issues about intellectual property and copyright protection and communication policy. So one way you can look at it is the connection between intellectual property policy and communication policy. The other way to look at it is to actually look at copyright policy as a form of communication policy. So as Peng Hwa mentioned early on, there's been a lot of discussion about the government's as well as the copyright holders' push for ISP to be the gatekeepers of protecting intellectual property rights. And that has created a lot of concern from the legislation in the US like SOPA and PIPA to the international treaties like the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement. There's been a lot of protest. There's been a lot of criticism by the NGOs community about how that's going to harm the functioning of the internet as well as free speech, free press, privacy, and other civil liberties. So it's actually quite interesting in terms of the connection because intellectual property is a blind spot, especially within the United States. That's true to some extent within the European Commission as well. So I remember when we had the Chinese Internet Conference way back at Georgetown, there was a representative from the State Department, and we were having the back and forth exchange about ISP liability and how that's going to affect both the Internet users and Internet freedom. And the response by the State Department is that, well, that's very interesting. I have not heard of the tension between intellectual property and free speech. Let me take it back to the officials from the State Department. What I immediately thought of from the response is not so much that he's not aware of the tension, but that he has a blind spot. He assumed that the protection of intellectual property is always protected by all the limitation, exception, breathing space, or fair use within the copyright system. So the tension has been, to some extent, removed or alleviated just because of the design of the copyright system. And that's why they don't see the big problem. And so when I was asked by the State Department to actually contribute an article for their e-journal USA, which is no longer continued, but they wanted to do a special issue on internet freedom. My immediate proposal is that, well, let me look at the tension between copyright protection and internet freedom, because that to some extent also ties into what Secretary Hillary Clinton has been talking about in terms of promoting internet freedom. The immediate reaction I got from the person who is commissioning me to write the article is that, well, that's fine, that's a very good topic, but you cannot endorse piracy, right? So the immediate reaction I got is that, well, they are equating having more limitation exception and having more flexibilities within the copyright system with piracy and counterfeiting. And so once they go in that direction, it makes it very difficult to have a discussion about where to strike a good balance between copyright and free speech. So what I want to focus on in my remarks is to focus on three different things that are related to China. The first one is about tension between intellectual property and internet regulation. The second is about the puzzle that's created by when you bring the two together. And the third one is about the dilemma, which is specific to China. So let me start off with the tension. So when we look at copyrighted content, we always have the tendency to assume that, well, if you really want to create your own speech, create your own content. You don't necessarily need to use other people's content in order to do that. But that's not always the case, especially for those countries that are under strong information control policy or under a strong censorship regime, they need to have content created by others for a number of purposes. So when we talk about China, we always talk about parody. Ergao is, for example, a very good example, how they're trying to use the copyrighted content to make fun of movies or current content or other type of messages. What they try to do is not so much that they need to use the same messages or the same images to say what they've intended to say, but actually to use it to create a new message, and that's parody. And so a lot of the discussion we have about parody is about how much flexibility we have within a system, whether we can rely on fair use or whether we can rely on fair dealing. So that's a pretty easy case. A much more harder case is that, and you'll probably hear from a lot of the presenters from both yesterday as well as today, is how a lot of those people in countries with strong information control policy or censorship regime, they will code messages within the same type of picture or the same type of message. So for example, if you want to criticize the mining operation in China, you can spend a lot of time talking about the rescue of miners in Chile, posting all those photos that are copyrighted by Associated Press as well as others. And you can create the same impact and image about what other people, how you want to talk about the mining operation and how unsafe it is within China. And the reason why it's quite effective for the local people is that when they look at what's going on there, they understand the message. There is something within there. Whereas for the outsiders, it's much harder for them to understand what's going on. So when you're doing research on the internet in China, sometimes you find that people spend a lot of time talking about entertainment, talking about celebrities. But in fact, a lot of them are trying to use entertainment and celebrities to try to make their point, fearing that they're going to suffer from repercussions or going to suffer for other things, mainly because they're criticizing the government or criticizing what's going on there. So sometimes we might need to repeat whatever that is presented by others or that's been copyrighted verbatim so that we can make a point to do that. Another example which I've seen is when people are talking about corruption in New Jersey. And they are posting the photos, they are posting the reports about corruption in New Jersey. But the subtext within there is that, one, they want to criticize corruption within a country. Two, they also want to criticize the hypocrisy within some of the policy when foreign presses are always saying that, well, China is so corrupt, other countries are not corrupt. Right? So there are a lot of subtext within there. But what a lot of users are trying to do is that they are relying on reposting of messages and photos to say the message that they don't really want to get caught saying. And so it's sometimes quite effective for them to do that, to communicate that way. So that's a very good example of how we can actually rely on copyrighted content to create our own speech without creating a parody, but using the same copy. Another example I love to use is how some governments sometimes would try to take advantage of the copyright system to use this as a pretext to go after the dissidents or NGO communities. So the example would be how the Siberian authorities have confiscated computers from environmental groups. And how the claim they made is that, well, they're trying to look at the computers to find out whether they use pirated Microsoft software. And when you're in Russia, a lot of computers will have pirated software. Right? So it's not that difficult for them to find that. But the reality is what they're trying to do is to find out who are the donors, what are the records, when are you going to plan any protest or other things that you have been working on, so that they got the computers, they know exactly what they're going to do. They also take away the computers so that they can delay whatever you're trying to do. So a lot of governments have been using that as a pretext, and I think that is going to be a little bit problematic because on the one hand, we want to make sure that authors get protected, which is a legitimate reason to have copyright protection. But on the other hand, there are also governments who are trying to take advantage of all those legislation that is out there about copyright protection and use it as a pretext to silence the dissident groups as well as NGO community. And I think so. My argument is that, well, if we have this type of concern, then we need to rethink about whether we want to set up the copyright system as a one-size-fits-all system for the whole international community. maybe those countries that have strong free speech concerns or strong information control policy, they need to have a different balance within the copyright system. Maybe they need to have more limitation exception. Maybe they need to have more flexibilities. Maybe they need to tone down on some of the criminal enforcement. Imagine those environmental groups who get caught by the Siberian authorities. If you have strong criminal enforcement penalties within the system, then it's going to be very dangerous because it's being used as a pretext, not so much to protect copyrighted content, but to actually use copyright to go after others. So that's the tension we always see between the copyright protection and internet regulation. The second thing I want to focus on is what I usually look at is the inconsistency within both the rhetoric as well as the policy about copyright protection and internet freedom. So when you look at a lot of the corporations, now they're pushing for stronger copyright protection, and they want copyright enforcement, whether it's criminal or whether it's civil, to be on the books in a lot of different countries. And yet for some of those countries like China, there's a very strong censorship regime that they can rely on to actually prevent the distribution and reproduction of a lot of those books, especially if the content is quite sensitive. What's quite interesting for me is that I was involved in a WTO case where the argument is that China didn't provide strong protection for copyright with respect to criminal procedure and criminal enforcement. And yet China has a strong censorship regime where they can rely on the censorship regime to actually stop the production and distribution. And yet a lot of companies don't want to rely on that regime for a lot of reasons. But at the same time, when you think about the policy perspective, it's actually much easier for them to rely on the public control regulations or whatever the content regulation out there with respect to the internet as well as the offline world, as opposed to insisting that there should be something like intellectual property. But at the same time, a lot of corporations believe that it's much more important to push for something that is called intellectual property because that is the type of protection they want to have. And so that will allow us to actually see whether there are other issues that they're going for. For example, are they concerned about intellectual property interest? Or are they concerned about control of information? Are they concerned about the distribution of the copyrighted content out there? But what's really interesting for me is that when you look, you flip this over to look at the internet regulation from government, it's also quite interesting too, because the government can always have stronger copyright protection to silence the critics, to silence the dissidents. If they don't want certain publication to be out there, they can always say that this has been published without authorization by the copyright holder. And yet when you look at China, China has not been pushing for stronger copyright protection to go after the unauthorized content either. So that raises two interesting questions. One is that are there other reasons why China doesn't want to push for stronger protection of copyright, knowing that stronger protection will also help them to maintain a good information control policy? Is it because of economics? Is it because of the different stakeholders that are within the system? Or is it because of the Public Security Bureau, who is not that interested in intellectual property issue, thinking that IP is mainly for foreigners? So that's one set of questions. The second set of questions that we can also think about is why the government doesn't push for stronger control, rely on the censorship regulation to actually stop the problem with respect to intellectual property. But as I mentioned earlier on, they can easily rely on censorship to actually prevent a lot of those unauthorized publication of the books from Disney, from others out there. But China decides not to do it. And when you think more about it, you actually have to think about how successful is the censorship policy. China can control certain content within a certain region for a certain period of time, but it's not that easy for China to use the censorship regime to control mass content. So one of the very successful things that China has been doing is rely on the censorship regulation to send out signals that you are being watched, that they are trying to do something. But if you ask them to make sure that all the information that should not be out there, that they need to stop, I don't think that's that easy for them to stop everything. And I think pirated content is a very good example. I think the scale is just too massive. And even if they rely on the current censorship regime or the content regulation, it's going to be very difficult for them to actually stop things to be out there. And that's why when you go onto the internet, sometimes certain websites have been banned, other times it has not been banned. It's not necessarily because that they don't want to ban those websites or there are ways to route around it, but it might suggest that the goal of this censorship mechanism is to warn people that, well, we are watching you. There are certain places you should not go to, but they know for sure that they don't have the resources. They don't necessarily have the technology to ban everything on the internet, and so they go for the same direction. So when we bring the two together, there are actually a lot of very interesting things we can look at in terms of whether the policy is consistent, whether policy is effective, and that is something that deserves more attention. And the final thing I want to end on is to pick up on a point I mentioned yesterday about how the issues about politics within the internet discussion is not so much about political speech or just pure politics, but it's actually about the political economy. So China is at a point where it wants to push for more innovation within the country so they can avoid the middle income trap. Because it continues to see a lot of countries that have been very successful at the middle income level, and then they stopped. They got stuck because they can no longer rely on manufacturing or other type of services. They need to rely on innovation and intellectual property to push for that. And there's been a lot of discussion about how China can become an innovative power. I think in the discussion from yesterday, from Bill and Gillian's paper, I think Bill was asked the question, how do you define innovation? Right? So that is an issue that a lot of people have been looking at. And innovation is a little bit more complicated because it relies on a lot of different factors. I think the things people immediately come to mind about innovation is about patents because it provides incentives for creating inventions. But copyright is also quite related, especially when you think about creative industry or creative clusters. So when Nukti economist Hwa Ang was asked, he's from Tsinghua University, when he was asked about what are the conditions China needs to have in order to become an innovative power, and he mentioned 5 different things. The first one is capacity in science, based on number of journal publications. The second one is innovative capacity, based on number of patents. The third one is ability to use new technology, based on the number of computers. So if you're thinking about the 560 million internet users China has, the number of computers is quite considerable. The fourth one is about capacity to use global information. So that's totally related to what we have here with respect to internet. And the fifth one is about capacity in R&D investment. So when you think about all of this together to become an innovative power, number 4 is actually quite complicated. Because when it talks about capacity to use global information, if the internet continues to be censored heavily, it's going to be very difficult for the local Chinese to be able to develop the capacity to use global information. You can still have access to information that is not banned, but at the same time, you cannot have all the information it needs in order to become innovative power. So to some extent, it shows how the dilemma that the Chinese authorities are going to face in the future in terms of how much they want to keep the control of the internet or how much they want to free up the internet for innovation purposes. But what's really interesting about this debate is that it's more about economy than about politics. So the reason why China may want to free up the control of the internet, not so much because it believes that it's a point where they don't need to control as much or they don't need to censor as much, but more because they fear that if they keep on controlling, then they might not have access to global information so that the country can catch up with others. And to some extent, that also ties to the push by a lot of the local players. For example, the ICT companies within China are also very concerned because the more control it is, the more difficult it is for them to do business. And so it makes a lot of sense for them to push for it. But that raises a very different issue in terms of the changing dynamics within a country. And that is the issue with respect to changing dynamics at the regional level. When you think about a lot of the ICT companies, it's basically near the coastal areas or the major cities. And yet for other for those other issues about, for example, protection of security or to make sure that stability is covered the whole country. So I think that's going to be a very difficult issue, especially with the leadership at the high up, in terms of how a lot of the development with respect to the ICT industry or creative industries are actually within certain provinces or within a certain part of the country. And yet they also need to think about our overall policy for the country in terms of stability, in terms of security, and information control. And so that raises a very difficult political issue, because some provinces might consider that, well, all the benefits to free up the internet, to provide more corporate protection, will not necessarily help us, because we are not the beneficiary within those states, within those provinces. And yet others may believe that, well, this is the way to go, because if China really wants to be innovative, that's the only way to go to get out of the middle income trap. And that would be a major political issue, because it's no longer just economics. It's about both the economic development of the country as well as the security and stability within the country.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to thank Peter for putting together this panel and recruiting me into the panel. I'm really happy to be here. I'll make a few points about the changing forms of Chinese internet control regime, based on an article actually which recently was published in the volume that Monroe edited called Routledge Handbook of Law. And my chapter is called Social Dynamics in the Evolution of China's Internet Content Control Regime. So I would like to acknowledge my thanks to Monroe for your support of this and many other projects. So one reason why I wrote this paper, of course, the main reason was because Monroe asked me to, but another reason was because I've been studying internet activism, internet protest, but you cannot really understand fully protest and activism without looking at the other side of the story, which is the control side of the story. Of course, there is a great deal of work about internet control and censorship to draw on. I felt that, in this literature, growing literature on internet censorship, we still do not have a strong sense of change, that there seems to be a sort of a static view of internet control and censorship regime. So I would like to emphasize, therefore, the possibility of change, not just on the side of the internet activists and netizens in internet culture, but power holders, authorities, control regime, various agents, actually, they also adapt to the changing circumstances. And in this particular case, I'm arguing that they are adapting to the internet protest and internet activism. So this is one sort of part of the idea behind this paper. The other is about, again, about the current state of work on internet control. I also got the sense that besides the sense that there is more or less a static view of China's internet control regime, there's also a sense that there's a monolithic state, that the Chinese state is this one thing, which I think is not terribly helpful for understanding the nuances, details, and even the human side of internet censorship and control, because there are humans running the machines and deleting and reading the postings and so on. And of course, there are multiple agents, multiple kind of agencies and government authorities doing different kind of work. So I want to also try to see whether there are different kind of agents and then what kind of work they do. So this is another part of my argument in this paper. So the first point I wanted to make with regard to this particular paper is that I think over a period of almost 20 years since the 1990s, since the mid-1990s when China's internet first began to develop. 1994, I think, China's first major regulation about computer security and so on was promulgated. So almost 20 years. And what I see is that there is a gradual shift, a gradual expansion of the modes of power in terms of the management and control of internet content. I'm here really focusing only on internet content instead of architecture. And the shift, or the expansion rather, is from a more coercive, the earlier period of more coercive and reactive form of control, of censorship, to a more proactive, more soft methods of control. There's actually a standard, sort of almost standard official term nowadays, which is social management of the internet, social management, 社会管理, internet management. I think this is a very important trend to the extent that we can recognize this trend. It's not that there's no more coercive policing of the internet, no more censorship, no more harassment of dissidents. That is still there, but I think there's more and more emphasis on social management, on soft management, on other kinds of proactive forms of control. So a few examples, some of the stories we are familiar with because they are in the media quite often. One form of soft social management, one example would be the so-called internet commentators, which is typical. There is a nickname for this, which is the 50-cent party. But internet commentator, it's not an institution. I think there's more to it than the simple term 50-cent party. It's almost become a standard institution of part of the management of the internet content. That it happens on the very basic lower levels of government. There is not much in the English news about this, but in the Chinese news, actually some Chinese local news channels are quite explicit about what they're doing. So if you do some Baidu search, you might be able to find local county news or radio stations, news release about they have just held a workshop training internet commentators about how to do their job. This kind of things actually happen at the basic, the grassroots level. And they also have instituted, in some places, they institute a system of honoring those internet commentators who are doing a very good job, commentating on the internet. But what actually they do, of course, we know what actually they do is posting anonymous comments on, basically following what the story, commenting on the story, try to shape public opinion in a relatively anonymous, invisible way, so that the regular users of the website may not be able to tell who is an internet commentator or who is a regular netizen. So this is, I think, part of that, an example of this bigger strategy of soft management of social control. We haven't seen, actually, there's so much talk about this 50-cent party, but we haven't seen any empirical work, systematic, careful empirical work. Partly, of course, is because it's difficult to interview, to have access with this. There is a political scientist, actually, who just finished a dissertation at Berkeley, who has done this work, but his work has not been published. It's probably going to be appearing in the next couple of years. But we do need a lot of empirical work. But we know that this is actually institution, sort of minor institution in operation on a grand scale. Another part of the story of new forms of social management or soft control is, again, very proactive presence in this case, it's visible presence. It's not invisible presence, but visible presence of Chinese official media agencies, media channels online, as well as regular government agencies. So I know we do have a number of researchers actually working on these on projects related to, for instance, government on Weibo. Several projects are going on this. Government on Weibo, public security agencies are now very active on Weibo. You know, Beijing, Shanghai, Chongqing, they all have a very active Weibo accounts with huge followings. And I think early on, it came up in the discussion that they are not just saying the official, very stiff official list on the Weibo accounts. It's the more kind of human interaction with other users, providing not just, it really is just providing information services for the citizens. For the, you know, the main goal is to, of course, there is a goal of monitoring public opinion, but also to have interactions with citizens to improve the image of the official agencies, public security agencies. Because one reason why I think there is so much censorship is because public, in a law enforcement authority has such a perception of the threat of what's happening online, and part of the threat comes from the very bad image of this of law enforcement authorities. So there is a lot of effort pouring into Weibo from these government agencies, public securities, as well as news and others, to try to improve the image of the government. And this has another part of the story, which I think is the bigger story of contemporary China, the sense of some kind of legitimacy crisis. This is, of course, open to debate. There is a debate among political scientists, experts on China, whether or not there is a legitimacy crisis. But there is certainly a lot of concerns about the sense of legitimacy among the legitimacy of the state, and therefore very important role of trying to mobilize new media, social media, to try to improve image of the government. And of course, also related to China's soft power strategy. Another very interesting part of this story, which we don't know a lot about, but we know a little bit, is the expansion of the internet control regime beyond state authorities. Most importantly, mobilization of civil society organizations, of the industries, the internet firms, as well as individual citizens, especially expert citizens, including communication scholars, into a system for monitoring public opinion, for monitoring the internet, for providing feedback about what kind of information is good or is not good, what kind may be deleted. So one of the major civil society organizations, or NGO, is the Internet Society of China, which is really a quasi-government organization. It's been in existence since the early 2000s. I think 2004 or 2005 it was established. And they were able to build, it's a society of industries, all kind of telecommunications companies, as well as research institutes. So they do a lot of campaigns, number of campaigns, and if you go to their website, it has all the list of their activities. Campaigns about self-regulation, self-discipline, and so on. Kind of really, I think, cooking up a whole media, a lot of stories just about every year about the importance of managing the internet, controlling the internet, dangers there, internet violence, online verbal violence, and so on and so forth. So this is one major civil society organization that is doing a lot of work in the service of the internet control, content control regime, and it's part of, you might say, it's being recruited into this regime. So in that sense, that's why I think this is an expansion of the regime. And then there is a great deal of emphasis on self-regulation and self-discipline. we don't know the effects, whether or not these kind of campaigns, emphasis on regulation, have any kind of significant effects, impact on the public, on the use of the internet. But certainly there is a lot of this initiative. We have among our audience, Jing Hong has been studying this issue. Maybe in the discussion you might want to chip in about self-regulation and the effects and privacy and so on. But this is certainly one of the, we see so many more stories in Chinese media about self-regulation and civil society and so on, as well as government use of the of the internet. So these are some of the broad trends. I want to just give a very broad overview of the main trends, which I think are becoming more and more clear. Of course, the question is why are we seeing this kind of shift? And I mentioned a couple of things. I want to also emphasize a few other points, how to explain, how to understand this major shift. I think partly, of course, is part of the whole evolution of the whole internet content control regime is part of the broader scheme of China's stability maintenance system. So Chinese government has been building this social stability maintenance system. It's almost becoming an official ideology, and it's very rare. But certainly, it's a huge system, and with a huge bureaucracy, and with a huge budget. Because I think a couple of years ago, there were news stories about how this budget, the national budget for stability maintenance in that particular year, I think it was 2011 or 2010, exceeded the military budget of that year. So, of course, huge amount of work going into various aspects related to stability maintenance, which is really to prevent mass protest, including preventing mass online protest. Internet protest in Chinese official term is often called mass internet online. Online mass protest or internet mass protest? So this is this shift or the broadening of the internet control regime. I think reflects the kind of changes or expansion of the whole stability maintenance system, and that stability maintenance system itself. The ideology, the practices, and the institutions have also been undergoing change from, I think, more coercive forms of policing protest to more proactive and very often soft forms of policing protest. And I think this partly was because of the lessons that the government authorities learned from 1989. That very coercive, repressive forms of policing may backfire, and it could be more effective to have selected, managed small pockets of resistance and protest, and it's much easier to manage, and then so that's why we see in recent years more protests. It seems that we're having more protests than before. But I think partly because the government now is more tolerant of small-scale protest activities. Certainly, environmental protest, the NIMBY-style environmental protest in major cities in these recent years, very good example. Another case, which I'm going to talk about in the next panel, is the Sudden Weekend protest. Early this year in January, the protest happened online. And I was following the event real time in Philadelphia, and people were so radical on Weibo. I was thinking, well, Weibo was going to be closed down. But it didn't happen. Weibo continued operating, even though, of course, there was censorship, there was filtering, and the editor, actually one of the senior Weibo editor himself came out with kind of self-confession about the difficulties of censoring this and how we actually manage our job just to seek public understanding of their job. They were censoring, but sometimes they would allow a very short time lag. So they'll give a posting 5 seconds before deleting it. But within that 5 seconds, that posting may already have been disseminated across the website. So it actually happened online, but it also happened offline in Guangzhou, in the streets in Guangzhou, in the Southern Weekend headquarters. People actually gathered on the street and protested about this case of censorship of a newspaper, of a very liberal newspaper, and there were images, photographs, digital photographs circulating online of the crowds in the street, and the police who were standing there watching, but not doing anything else. I think that partly because it was in a transitional period, leadership transition, a new leadership just came into their office. But partly I think it also reflected this new mode of responding to mass protest, and I think it's more nuanced. There are more ambiguities. There's certainly the government wants to prevent this kind of happenings, but there's the understanding more and more that it's difficult to prevent them. That people are angry. There are so many issues that they would rather let it happen. Let some cases happen, but within the managed scale, and therefore there is an adjustment accordingly of the forms of policing the protest, both in the street and online. I think I should stop here.
Good, thank you. Well, it took more time than we expected, so I'm going to open up to the floor now for questions. Yeah, okay, Roger.
I'd like to thank all the 3 speakers for the very rich and clear presentation, and I want to sort of come back to something that Peter said as connected to Guobin's speech. Peter, you said, and I think quite rightly so, that the Chinese government cannot control everything, and that there are cracks in the system, and as we've discussed over the last couple of years, piracy is one of those. But it does seem to me that there is a notion of, even if it isn't perfect, does it do what it's supposed to do? And I think here the answer is that to the extent that the Chinese media governance system has been there primarily to ensure the continued political monopoly and organizational monopoly of the Communist Party, well, it's still there. And so to that extent, it would seem to me that one of the things that we have to understand or look at is not just, is the system working perfectly, but is it fit for the purpose? And so then we need to think about what that purpose is, but also what I think is what we need to, is that we need to know what are the ideas that inform that purpose. And I think we sometimes are too quick to say, it is only ideology, it is meaningless, which I think is untrue. Ideology contains within itself, I think, very deep epistemological notions about how societies are perceived to operate, and that therefore inform what the government wants to do. Very often I find this is a problem when I read papers, that this is where the analysis ends. We talk about the logic of control, and the Communist Party wants to be in control, and it wants to be in control because it wants to do the things it wants to do, and there we stop. But it seems to me that one of the things that we should be doing is we should be unpacking what it is the government wants to do, because that actually allows us the grammar that we need, it seems to me, to understand the way that this communication is governed. And so it seems to me that when you look at the foundational documents of the party, this isn't just an ideology which is based on the imposition of brutal power. There is a method to this. There is an idea, and well, you can question the extent to which the individuals who are working in the state really believe it. But there is this notion that this politics is scientific politics that will lead to a better world, and that therefore there are things that can be discussed, and there are things that cannot be discussed because they are founded on those scientific bases and therefore must be considered as correct. And so it seems to me that when we then look at protests, categorize them, for example, on the basis what is it that they're protesting against? Are they protesting against the particular implementation of a certain policy by an individual state official or an individual body? Are they protesting against the policy qua policy? Are they protesting against the constitutional structure of the state at large? Or are they protesting against the ideas, the structure of ideas that gives states, that gives the meaning to that state structure? And it seems to me that very often we are limited to talking about those two things, and that is meaningful, and that tells us a lot about how Chinese law and regulation with relation to the internet is going to be made.
So let me start. So when we talk about censorship in China, there are two things we try to explore but may disagree. So the first one is, as you pinpoint, is what is the purpose? I think that's very important. For me, I think the purpose of censorship are two things. One is to kill the chicken to scare the monkey. The second one is fool the masses. And both of them are basically from Chinese ideology. The first one is to make sure that you know exactly that somebody is monitoring the internet and trying to, that they are going to take action if you don't control yourself. Whether it's through self-censorship or through direct censorship, or just get the users not to do it, at least sometimes it serves the purpose, right? Unless you go through a tipping point where it gets an out-of-control situation. The second one is to fool the masses. The fear is not about the panic within those people who are knowledgeable, who can control themselves, but about those people who might not be. So when you go to speak in major universities, you find that you might have more leeway to talk about things on campus as opposed to going out to the street and talk about what's your ideas. And I think that to some extent resonates with this fool the masses policy. And I think that is debatable because a lot of the discussion, including some of the literature that Jack and David has tracked in a survey, is that they are talking about how censorship is a policy to control the information from being distributed and reproduced. But that might not be the purpose of the censorship policy. So I think that is something that is quite important for us to explore. The second thing that's quite important for us to explore, although it's much more difficult, is whether the leaders can have a sincere belief that stability is more important than freedom. And I think that is more a question at the policy level. I think a lot of people, especially within major governments, have a tough time thinking that after the class struggle, after Cultural Revolution, the leaders is totally irrational to have this belief that stability is more important. But I think to some extent we need to think about whether we can come up with the conclusion that it's just a new advice policy. That is something that is not necessarily good for the country. But the bigger question is that, well, can they have a sincere belief that they believe that it's more important to focus on stability as opposed to freedom? And I think that is also worth exploring. But let me tie it to Guobin's very interesting presentation. When you think about information control policy, there are two different tracks. One is censorship. The other is propaganda. When you get less censorship, then you have to go more to propaganda. And that's why you have the 50-cent party. You have the government officials on Weibo. Because they are trying to get more out there. One is to control so that you don't have a lot of criticism. The other is to actually have their own sides of the story. So as we see the internet being controlled less and less, we'll probably see more of those proactive measures that Guobin has talked about. Because that is the whole information control policy. I think the tendency for us is that when we think about information control, it's about censorship. But it's much broader than that. And I think we need to look at the whole system, how they're going to control and how they go from censorship on one hand and to proactive measures or propaganda on the other end.
Okay, before you respond, can this point about stability versus freedom of expression, the Chinese word for law and order is government, meaning that no government means no law and order. So in that sense, it seems like history would say that stability is more important than freedom of expression.
There is a phrase in Chinese, 稳定压倒一切.
Yeah, so I don't know, Guobin, respond. take like my comment for what it's worth. Yeah.
I think, well, it's hard to say. That is the rhetoric, that stability overwhelms everything, is it? How to translate it? I think we need to take a historical perspective again to understand why it is the case that the government puts so much emphasis on stability. And this is also the official line that, there is all this talk for the past decades about all the disorder and the chaos created by the Cultural Revolution, and how the national economies and everything about Chinese culture was affected by that kind of chaotic situation. And therefore, there's this priority to prevent any kind of similar chaotic situation to appear again. And this was the kind of rhetoric that the government used in 1989. There was direct comparisons of the 89 student movement. The students, they were like red guards. And it's almost like today, they will still hear this kind of rhetoric both in China and in the Western media, comparing sort of online activities and discourse to kind of red guard discourse, red guard verbal violence. So I think we need to, that's one point about stability. So there is a history to that. Another part of the story, I think there's always, we need to, and this is a point that a few political scientists, for instance, Elizabeth Perry at Harvard, have been making for a long time, and they have a wonderful book that was published a couple of years ago called Mao's Invisible Hand, where they emphasize how in Chinese political culture, not just communist culture, but in imperial political culture, the system has this inbuilt ability of encouraging certain kind of protest activities as a way of venting the anger of the masses. And that's one reason why the system, whether the imperialist system or the communist system, have been able to survive under this kind of chaotic situations, because there's that kind of, it almost has turned the protest into some kind of input signal. And of course, but only only to the extent that this can be managed. Of course, there are occasions, like again the Cultural Revolution, where everything went out of control. But in general, I think there's that sense, and I think the current leadership has a subtle understanding of this kind of protest activities as small scale of institutional, you might say, mass input.
I want to link what you just said with what Anupam talked about CSR, and I'm wondering to what extent, for example, if you take the Google case, and you had Googling freedom, so we discussed this start of 2010, but I'm wondering to what extent should Google so-called protest? In other words, Google should obey its own CSR codes and not abide by the Chinese rules. On the other hand, being a lawyer, you have to abide by the rules of the land. Coke in China should have Chinese characters, right? Coke should taste like Coke, should have Chinese characters. So to what extent should you have, what should Google do?
Right. I think that's a very difficult position for companies like Google. Now, many people have suggested that Google's actions in this case were entirely self-interested, that it was actually just losing to Baidu in China, and so this was kind of making a pretty face of their disastrous performance. But 1/5 of the market, of search market, is still a very significant percentage, and so giving up even that 1/10 of the market is still giving up significant potential income. And so I actually think my view is that their concerns were more sincere, and of course they've had the luxury of always feeling like they do exactly that their politics comport with their business interests, and so that's generally been the way they've operated. And they found that in China, the two ran into conflict, and so didn't have a way to reconcile them, and of course led to their kind of position to retreat to Hong Kong, as you know, and the concerns in this context are, they have people on the ground. So you'll hear the Google people talking about this. They have people physically on the ground, and so they're concerned about their employees. And so they face this issue across the world. In Italy, I don't know if you followed this, Google's executives were convicted, Google's executives sitting in California were convicted of crimes in Italy because they failed to take down a video quickly enough showing the ridicule of a disabled child. And so they've been concerned about the projection of power against their employees around the world. So you've got this direct conflict between the local law that might require something of the company and its own internal CSR kind of approach. And so leading to this, this kind of halfway point. So in many of these cases, there's no clear answer. The fact is that companies that don't have a physical presence on the ground, they feel much more free to do whatever they want, right? So if you aren't actually if you don't have assets in Vietnam, you are much more likely to not worry about what the local government demands of you. And so this has certainly been the case of some of these companies that have just snubbed their thumbs, snubbed their noses at the local government. But let me just pivot a little bit to the question that you posed. My general thought is that it's a little, we may be in a point where, yes, you're right that certainly the regime has been good enough to achieve what it wants, but but I wonder if it's always going to be good enough. It won't be good enough at the point it's not good enough, right? And then we can say it was all just brewing, in the background.
But that's what they say about our crisis. They say, you see, we knew that the system wasn't going to work, and now you're in crisis and have been for 5 years, and you can't still even explain why you're in a crisis.
Right. So it's hard, we may be able to, it may be easier to see the bubble after it's been burst. And it may be hard to know exactly where we are in the long run of history. And so I suggested earlier that in the conversations that we had this morning about the history of the Chinese internet scholarship, that we're still very early in this. And so expecting revolutionary change, at internet speed is perhaps a little bit too much to ask.
Okay, yeah. Do you
Go.
You want to go first? This is a lady.
It's a lady.
Go ahead.
Sure, I have a question for Professor Chander about the corporate social responsibility. It's definitely a very interesting topic for internet companies. But corporate exists purely for the maximization of profit, and especially in the stage of neoliberalism. I don't know whether you read Sarah Van-Adviser's book, The Compassion In. So she explained how there are different levels of engagement into corporate social responsibility. So for example, some companies promote their corporate social responsibility as just abiding by the country's laws. And some companies, such as the Body Shop, committed to environment that their production and process is not like minimize the harmful environment. So my question is, in such a neoliberal stage, how do you draw the line between corporate social responsibility as purely a public relation effort versus it really care, especially when the question should be within, are we even, should we hold accountable for internet companies to uphold the very important and fundamental human rights such as freedom of expression?
So I want to challenge your premise. You began by saying that corporations exist entirely to profit maximize. I think that's certainly one very important view. And my claim in my paper is that even that view ultimately supports very serious corporate social responsibility in unfree societies. Okay. So that's the kind of, even applying Milton Friedman and carrying the analysis forward, it supports that. But corporations, as you know, have existed over the last millennium for many purposes. And so universities are founded on corporate charters. And so corporations are creatures of the law, and therefore creatures of human beings as acting as in societal kind of agglomerations. And so can be tasked with whatever we want to task them with. I saw in this kind of walking around Oxford yesterday something about corporations may have been involved with the translation of the King James Bible. Is that so? Some historian will tell me this, that the entities that were tasked with the translation might have actually been corporations. And so certainly, but corporations are involved in lots of things, and I think that we should certainly as a society not accept the simple equivalence of corporation to shareholder wealth maximization. So when I say that, I don't mean to accept that view. I'm simply saying within the logic of that view, there is actually that view itself results in corporate social responsibility in this context. So I think then, we need to insist on, serious corporate social responsibility, whether the companies, feel it in their bones, or whether it's profit maximizing or not, but that society should insist upon it. So I think it should be there as I think it should actually be there as a legal matter as well.
Yeah, Mandu?
I've been interested in the dual idea of self-regulation. The question of who's the self in self-regulation. Is the self the industry, or is the self, as seems to be the case, more the individual? And what does it mean when the society shifts from self-regulation at the kind of intermediary level to self-regulation as a kind of citizenship duty? And this led, I wanted just to a question about, which I was exploring with Wu Yang, which is bottom-up censorship. That is to say, the self-regulating not only oneself but one's neighbor. So these questions of how to conceptualize the self and self-regulation seem to me to be important.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's of course a big idea, and more of you have a book on this. In the Chinese case, which has very useful theoretical insights. But in the Chinese case, I was thinking specifically self-regulation in the sense that it was non-state, which would include both individual citizens and enterprise business firms, and they actually use this corporate social responsibility rhetoric, except it's a responsibility, I don't know to whom, maybe to the state, for instance, preventing subversive discourse from appearing on their website. So I think it's non-state, that individual firms, citizens, NGOs, all these entities should be responsible for your own behavior, for your own speech.
With self-regulation by transparency.gov or whatever, the Google's transparency thing is a form of self-regulation in a way, which is to disclose. It also goes to your point, be transparent about the requests that you get for taking down things, right? I'm not sure.
I think it also includes actually mutual supervision, in the sense, because one of the interesting things that the Internet Society of China has been doing is that they created a website for citizens to voluntarily report any kind of online behavior that they find offensive or illegal, including all various kind of speech, especially websites with pornographic content and so on. And they have statistics of how many reports they receive, and it's large numbers of reports that they receive from individual citizens to them. So I don't know, maybe this self-regulation is also about mutual regulation among citizens, and I think it's a way of lowering the transaction costs for the state to manage. The state now is incapable of managing all these complex issues, and therefore has to delegate some of its responsibilities to individuals or to business firms. Interesting.
Ask two questions. Go ahead first. Go ahead.
Peng Chen, yeah, go ahead.
I have a question for Guobin. You commented on the changing mechanism of control. I'm just wondering if
nominally is still a Communist Party, that what tend to be censored are ideas related with liberal democracy, human rights, and these kind of things. But I think there's probably also change in the last decade also. For example, with the whole Bourgeois incident, one of the first websites that was shut down was the Orthodox leftist website. And also, if you look at the sort of, you know, what kind of content gets censored, I think also content related to calling for collective action of, for example, migrant workers is more likely to be censored. Maybe collective action of urban residents organizing for environmental concern. So in that regard, I think for me, the fact that the Nanhang Zhongguo incident didn't lead to the shutdown of microblogging sites is not surprising, because that whole incident is not really radical, you know, given the current political situation. I think in a way, Nanhang Zhongguo is posing itself as the opposite of the government to sort of, in a way, to establish their status on the market, because it is still you know, part of the provincial party committee in its so I just
right. Well, I think the two responses. First of all, there is a whole set of regulations, and new regulations will be appearing about what kind of contents to censor. Right? There is a whole list of things, subversive contents, illegal contents, and so on, to be censored. I think that's the kind of institutional aspect of this. But I think the more effective, the real effective mechanism, if there is a mechanism there, is it's not exactly self-regulation, but it's almost like it borders on self-regulation. In other words, besides all those guidelines, and the guidelines are not always followed, not necessarily followed at all, the propaganda department, the central propaganda department, refuses ever to say, precisely what needs to be censored at any given time. And it's up to you, website citizens, especially website managers, to figure out, to decide what should be censored, what should be considered, illegal or improper. I think that is a kind of very, I think it's a mechanism of control, and it's very effective. So effective is because people have to, managers, editors are forced to think about this all the time, and then to be aware of the potential risks if they really violate any kind of unknown, hidden criteria, principles. I think that would be the kind of a mechanism, and I think we see this more and more, but except, of course, it operates in a way that's very difficult to detect.
Okay, it's what we would call, my colleague done a paper on this, administrative discretion. So the idea is that the laws are not debated in Parliament or anything, but decided in the end by somebody who's an official appointed by the minister, I guess, yeah. And that gives him a lot of room to decide. Okay, one question.
I have a question in two parts. One is probably for Peter. And a few months ago, there was this conference in Dubai on the future of international telecommunication. It was framed very much as a conference of the free internet, free word against the control of internet. But a few days before the conference, there was an agreement, also by the ITU, on deep packet inspection. And everybody seemed to agree on that. Because deep packet inspection, in one way, in the free world, allows companies to track who, peer-to-peer network, and who is using the most bandwidth. In the non-free world, of course, I'm using this category in a critical way, not because I believe it's a free word, and in the free word, it allows the government to spy. So in a way, it seems that there is a global agreement on a kind of a technological, I don't want to be technological determinist here, but on a tool that allows to bring together words that seems very different. And the result is the individuals are losing out, either because they are experimenting in new ways of sharing knowledge or to contest power. The second piece of the question is on the 50 cents market and 50 cents arm. There is this idea that's been, I didn't know that there was very little research. I thought there was research on that, but it has been criticized as kind of evil impersonification saying the bad things to power and is sort of asking the government to be responsive. But at the same time, these people are paid by political parties in order to skew the debate online. So it seems to me that sometimes we articulate this as the free word against the non-free word, but there is a lot of commonalities. And it seems more it's just about the existing power structure fighting against individuals or people trying to distribute like that. And,
okay, good. Well, absolutely. The PRISM issue is commonality in China and what's happening out there in the US. Yeah. If you didn't want, I guess, if any more questions, sorry, any more?
No, we can take more. Yeah.
Oh, okay, just one last one. Yeah.
Okay. No, it was a very brief comment on what we were just discussing about on content regulation, and it's one of the topics that we discussed yesterday as well. It seems to me that Chinese legal culture is one where you want to maximize, where you want to achieve a predetermined outcome in whatever way, and it's the outcome that legitimizes the rule. And so the notion is, and you see this in Article 1 of every regulation, this is the outcome that we want. In order to create a harmonious online society, we have made these rules. And then you get a couple of vague pointers. But the notion is anything that causes us not to reach Article 1 is illegitimate. And so the legal system itself is not built on the notion that we create structural rights-based processes because society is unpredictable and whatever happens will at least have protected the minimum rights of everyone. No, you say, this is where we want to go, and everything that helps us get there is legitimate, and all the rest is illegitimate. And it creates this enormous space, and of course to get there we need stability, and when you read, if I can just quote from this is the research agenda that propaganda director Liu Qibao published in Xiushu just 2 weeks ago, which I've translated, pretty much, which lists all the research priorities that are going to get government money in the social sciences for the next year. It essentially says, and I quote, to ensure that we can guarantee that the people live and work in peace and happiness, and that we have a stable society and the country knows peace and tranquility, we must deepen research on strengthening social management, guaranteeing and improving people's livelihood, and research relating to issues directly affecting the masses' interests. So this is good. That's where we want to go, and we need to find out what are the rules, the social laws to get there.
Good observation. So I will give each speaker here a couple of minutes to round up and complete our discussion.
Okay, so your question actually highlighted why I was so bothered by the blind spot that different government and different policymakers have. So from the standpoint of US, EU, Japan, Korea, what they're pushing for is quality of service, right? They see the benefit of having the packet inspection. And from the standpoint of those authoritarian governments or those governments with strong information control policy, is censorship. What's really troubling is that when you talk about technology, because of a blind spot, they forget about the unintended consequences. So the quality of service they're focusing on, they forget the impact on free speech and other things in other countries. Whereas for those countries with strong information control policy, the more they think about the benefits to censorship, they forget the fact that how they control information and the internet actually affects whether there will be quality of service or not. And that, to some extent, actually ties to what Anupam talks about early on with respect to Global Online Freedom Act. When they were pushing for the Global Online Freedom Act, what they are arguing is that, well, we need to determine whether you can disseminate technology that will circumvent information control. And yet, from a standpoint of e-commerce and intellectual property, they're so concerned about people having the technique to circumvent corporate protection technology to protect the copyright content. So one question that I keep on asking the State Department as well as others is that how can you reconcile the two? On the one hand, you say that there should be no circumvention, and on the other hand, you want to go for circumvention, and then the response is that, well, we just determine whether it's circumvention for the purposes of free speech or circumvention for the purposes of copyright protection. But with respect to technology, you can't do that. And so that's the challenges.
Great. And so with respect, just to follow up on Peter's observations, the ITU was a very important moment, but I think we have to step back a little bit in the US politics to look at the Stop Online Piracy Act, which I think signaled an important political turn in the United States, where if the United States, which maybe has no problem with deep packet inspection, as the government, potentially, as we've learned more recently, it couldn't really take that perspective directly in these kinds of international fora, because the Stop Online Piracy Act had shown the vast political mobilization of people on the internet, right? At least people mediating their engagement via the internet. And so the US took a kind of strongly free speech line at the ITU and a pro-privacy line at the ITU, I think in large part informed by, I think it's concerned about deep packet inspection being used by authoritarian regimes, et cetera, but there's a strong concern that there's a huge constituency in the United States that would really object to a kind of UN mandate that supported this kind of use of the internet for surveillance. Now, mind you, there's another aspect of this, which is the US relationship to international law generally. What is the ITU doing? Well, it's providing an international treaty that would support domestic actions, right? The United States doesn't feel like it needs an international treaty to support its domestic actions, right? It can do what it wants. It doesn't need the imprimatur of the ITU. And so other countries may be more in need of that kind of international sanction. And so I think, especially to combat complaints by the State Department, et cetera, that they are doing something inconsistent with international law, right, which is what the State Department has historically done when it's complained about censorship, et cetera, and surveillance. And so I think with the ITU in Dubai in December 2012, you see really this kind of the politics of free speech and surveillance kind of cashing out on an international level. And you see that it's very complicated, that countries have very unexpected positions in this kind of space. And the EU, wasn't on all fours with the United States early on, right? So you see lots of kind of alliances that form and dissipate because of every state has security concerns, and the security apparatus may well want the powers that other people might be more skeptical about.
I think I'll leave with a question. We've talked a little bit about the neoliberal aspect of corporate social responsibility, global agenda of privacy, intellectual property. So my question is, actually I've been thinking about this, but I don't have an answer to this question, is to what extent is the Chinese shift, if it is true there is such a shift in terms of the methods of controlling, managing the internet, to what extent is this shift a reflection of a broader global trend? I think there is evidence that this is a global trend, that we know that, for instance, the policing of Occupy movement in New York police used both coercive means and invisible means of surveillance and monitoring the activists. In the social movement literature, there is more and more study about changing forms of policing mass protest in the West, and scholars have been arguing that after 9/11, there is more and more emphasis on intelligence-based policing of protest, collecting of information and so on behind the scenes. And of course, to what extent is the Chinese regime learning from the global players? So as I said, I don't have an answer to this question yet, but I suspect this is also a major historical shift, we might say, in terms of the forms of political power and its relationship with the citizens.
Okay. So I think 3 panelists.